Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Privacy and Security for GenAI. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items to go over. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording later on after the webinar is over. Also, this webinar will be quite interactive today. There will be some polls that you will see pop up on your screen frequently, and please feel free to answer those. And you can also look at the results of the polls by clicking the little polls tab button at the bottom right corner. Finally, please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the questions button at the bottom right corner as well. And we will be answering all the questions at the end of the webinar. With that, let's get started. And let's turn it over to our first speaker, one of our speakers today. Min Heng, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Min Heng Ko. I head up the product team here at Baffle. Like most other IT product managers nowadays, I've been immersing myself in all things generative AI. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, my esteemed colleague, Sushant.
Thanks, Min Heng. Hi, everyone. My name is Sushant. I run marketing here at Baffle. I've been in the B2B software and cloud services space for about 25 years. All the way starting with the browser wars, if you can remember way back then at the early stages of the internet, or I guess at the commercialization of the internet. Spent a lot of time with data security, as well as infrastructure software. So we'd like to have a sense of who's in the audience today. So Hormaz, if you push out the first poll, if you can please respond so we kind of know the audience. The question is really, which team are you part of in your business or organization? Are you part of information security? Are you in the data analytics, data science? Is application development? Are you executive management or other? And please put in the chat what group you are. So let's go ahead and let people vote. Looks like we got a number of people in information security. Some are in executive management. We do have a number of people who are other, so please do put yourself in the chat what group you represent so we have a sense of who the audience is. All right. I would say it's mostly executive management and InfoSec, which is great. I think that's the right audience for this. So let's start with the agenda. We're going to talk about private data use cases for GenAI, right? Moving on beyond the public case for ChatGPT, when you have private data, what can you do with it? What are some of the use cases that you want to consider with private data? When you're using private data, there's always security risks. So we'll talk about what are the risks that you need to be concerned about and take steps to make sure you're protected from. We'll talk about the options to protect the data with GenAI. We'll do a demonstration. So this is really important. You'll be able to see for the first time how to protect your data with GenAI, as well as both on the putting it into GenAI, as well as the responses when you get from prompting. This is so definitely, I think you'll find that interesting. We'll do a summary, and then lastly, we'll do next steps and Q&A. So let's talk about the potential uses of private data with GenAI. So the first one that we've come across is customer support, right? You have a GenAI chatbot that leverages existing customer support database to assist customer success team with resolving customer issues in a timely manner. So you can imagine and this is where you get into the idea of helping your newest or least experienced customer support reps get the wisdom knowledge of your more experienced ones, right? So by using the chatbot, they can ask questions as, here's the symptoms that my customer is having. What are the top 3 likely causes, right? And then be able to use the chatbot to help them work with the customer to identify what is the real issue and what are the causes and what are the root causes and how to fix it. The second one is insurance coverage recommendations. We talked to an insurance company who said, they have a huge churn in their insurance agents. And the biggest issue is the insurance agents just don't know what to recommend. They don't have the experience of the ones that have been there 5-10 years. And when they're talking to a potential customer, what is the right insurance package that they should offer? So the GenAI tool can help the new reps leverage the experience of veteran reps in identifying the best coverage package for potential coverage, right? So again, it could be a chatbot, it could be some other application, but something where it says, I have a customer with, mom, dad, 3 kids, they live in this area, right? They have 3 cars. What is the right package insurance coverage for them, right? And be able to provide essentially best practices for that. A third use case that we've seen is legal document search and summarization, right? So a GenAI tool that can provide insights into patterns in existing legal contracts and answer questions relating to these contracts without time-consuming human review. So you can imagine a large organization that does business, throughout nationally, but also potentially globally. But more than likely, this would be limited to within one nation. And to be able to say, okay, what are the clauses that we have across all of them? What are the clauses that are for this specific county or this specific city or this specific state? And be able to look through all the contracts and then come up with the right clauses and be able to come up with a contract that really is the best practices, right? It will be useful in terms of being able to look at that. But there's also a fair amount of confidential data in those contracts, right? So how do you make sure that information doesn't get leaked? So let's move on.
So Sean, you've raised some very compelling use cases there. In terms of being able to use private or even confidential data, what sort of security risks are we looking at?
Sure, this is a good question. So let's talk about the potential data security risks, right? So the first one is unfettered access to massive amounts of company data. And as you can see from this article, the Microsoft AI team accidentally leaks 38 terabytes of private company data. 38 terabytes is a lot. Well, first question you may have is, how do they have so much? Well, because they're the kind of AI systems, the more data, essentially, the better. So they are trying to pull as much data as possible to feed into their models. So they have access to all this. If you don't put in the proper controls and regulate access to it, you now are giving people access to immense amounts of data that you probably shouldn't have, right? So that's probably the first risk that you have to watch out for is, when you're collecting all this data, how do you make sure that only people with the right access can actually see the data? Another risk is essentially leaking out your data, either through your PII data, the adversarial prompting, or just a hallucination, right? So you can see the couple articles that we posted here. The one that I found the most interesting is the first one. Google researchers attack prompts ChatGPT to reveal its training data. And all they said is repeat this word forever, poem, 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 poem. And it leaked the data, right? And it just logically doesn't make sense how that would cause ChatGPT to reveal its training data, but it did, right? And this is part of the thing that is I think when we see with GenAI is it's still in the early stages. So it's a little bit of a black box, and you're not quite sure when you do X, will you get what happened? Why did Y happen? Some of the other ones are, OpenAI's custom chatbots are leaking their secrets, right? You can create a custom chatbot, but the data it's built on is easily exposed. And then, kind of in the bottom right, you'll see the questions raised as Amazon Q reportedly starts to hallucinate and leak confidential data. And this becomes one of the challenges with hallucination is if your model has PII data, when someone says, hey, it's leaking it, how do you know it's in a hallucination versus the real data, right? It's like, well, we made sure that it's not supposed to reveal the data, but how do you know it's a hallucination? So that becomes quite challenging, right? Because now you have to dig back through, and like I said, right, there isn't necessarily a real X versus Y, right? If you do X, you get Y with GenAI. So it may have happened at one time, but you don't necessarily know that. The last thing is governments are paying attention to privacy in GenAI. This is a topic that has gotten, I would say, from most people's attention, right? The public, companies, and governments. So here's an article about ChatGPT violated European privacy laws, right? Italy's telling chatbot maker OpenAI. So there is going to be a, I would say, I don't necessarily know that there's going to be regulation, but there is definitely interest in by governments to say, is GenAI applications, right, following the rules, or do we have to create new rules? And so this is an area of concern. So we've gone through some of the concerns, but we're curious what you're thinking about this. So we have another poll, and the question we have for you is, how concerned are you about data leakage with GenAI? Are you not worried? Are you worried? Are you very worried? Go ahead and submit your vote, and let's take a look to see what the audience is thinking. So I would say the two highest ones are worried, very worried. There are some people who are not worried, which is good. But let's see if that turns out to be the case. But there is a general concern about data leakage with GenAI. So let's move on to the next question, which is, what are the compliance implications, right? We talked with the previous slide about, do the existing rules, how do they impact GenAI? So you can see some of the rules that are on the right? Something specific such as PCI, DSS 4.0, HIPAA. There's also more general ones like GDPR. The main takeaway, I think, is that you need to have access controls on data, right? So if you go into the three bullets on the left, right? So the core to all data privacy is that access to sensitive must be controlled, and auditors check for proof of this control. So it's not only that you have the access controls, you need to be able to prove it. So that's the second part becomes really interesting, because how do you make sure that you can prove it? And then the next thing is, when you look at your previous systems, right? There's an access control list or capability token on an object to define, enforce, and prove access controls, right? So if you think about your customer data, right? There's a table, there's a column, there's something that has the PII that now has an access control. That's what is the kind of traditional information. But when you look at the current GenAI systems, they can't implement the required access control because there's no such thing as that object. So Min-Henk will talk more about that in a little bit. But the basic takeaway that you should come up is that GenAI is, should fall under these regulations, mainly because these regulations don't specifically talk about any specific application, but the use of data in any application. And so there may not be new regulations, these regulations may be, but the point is that the current assessment is that these regulations apply to GenAI and that you still need to maintain compliance with them. So I know we just did a poll, but we actually do have another poll because we're curious what is happening with your data security and compliance, privacy impacting GenAI, right? Is it blocking your GenAI? Are you hesitating because you're not sure, or is it having no impact on your GenAI? So again, right, how is data security and compliance and or privacy impacting GenAI project? So go ahead and vote. So fair number of you have said that you're hesitating, which kind of makes sense because you need to understand, right, what's the implication on data security and compliance and privacy on GenAI. I'd say the next one, no impact and blocked, are pretty close. So let's see if hopefully that doesn't come back to bite anyone. But with that, let me now turn it over to Min-Henk to talk to you about the controls over sensitive data with GenAI system. Min-Henk?
All right, thank you, Sushant. As Sushant had mentioned earlier, really core to compliance is the fact that you have control. I saw there were a lot of InfoSec folks here in the audience today, and I suspect you've gone through some form of audit or some sort of compliance effort. And the term controls must, ring in your head quite a bit, because that's what a lot of times what auditors are looking for and looking for proof of. Now, what I want to do is maybe try to start from the ground up and kind of examine control and try to explain why intuitively we all kind of have this doubt or this hesitation about whether or not we can actually secure GenAI in its current form. And if you don't mind me really going back to basics, I do want to talk about maybe some more traditional IT systems, the ones that we're already familiar with, right? The databases, the file system. And there, access control was always fairly straightforward, right? To have any form of access control, you needed a subject, you needed an object, and a permission that binds it to. For example, those of you who are DBAs will be very familiar with the idea that you have database users and you have tables and schemas, and you would do grants of permissions like insert, update, select. Very straightforward, deterministic, easy to prove. You just dump out your permissions table to your auditor and you say, yes, I can prove to you that these users have access and these other users don't. Likewise, with file systems, we had file system ACLs. You had essentially your OS user, or if you had an identity management system, you can integrate with that. Those are your users and roles. You have files as your objects, or even directories as potential objects. And again, very well-defined permissions. You can essentially do read, write, even execute if you're talking about OS file system privileges. So access control was something that is something that we almost take for granted, but it was very well enforced and very well defined. When it comes to generative AI, something kind of goes awry, right? We still have the subject. We still know who we are. We still know the users. And we kind of have a semblance or a sense of what the permissions we want are. Usually it's we want to be able to use the GenAI application. We want to see and access, basically read some of the data. There's less updates. It's mostly about right now about getting data out. But the part that gets a little bit fuzzy is what exactly is the object to which you're applying this control. And I think this is a part that causes all of us to hesitate or have some concern, right? Well, right now, for all practical purposes, it's all or nothing. Once you give a subject, give someone access to the GenAI application, whatever information you've put in your GenAI application, and by that I mean it could be the context documents for your RAG pipeline, it could be whatever training data you put in the LM model, that essentially is, all for potential taking by the end user, right? Because right now, there's no easy way to limit some users to have access to one piece of data versus another. Very different from what we're used to as far as file system and databases are concerned. So this is what's causing compliance heartburns, right? This is what when you want to try to explain to your auditor, well, I've got this GenAI application and I'm enforcing least privileges, and you have to answer the question, how? Well, we don't have how right now. So what exactly is the solution to this problem? Well, if we were to think about what current GenAI, especially text-based GenAI is doing, the language model essentially is trying to take a large body of text and break it down into individual tokens. And these tokens typically are words, right? So what we're really saying is that in this world of GenAI and text models, we're actually shifting from sort of these very large coarse-grained granularity objects to almost like a word-by-word granularity. So in reality, what really you need to do and what the object has become is really the individual data values. And since it's now the individual data values that essentially are sort of what you're dealing with, your controls now actually, for better or worse, have to be done on this data value level. The good news is that most compliance requirements are not saying that you should just have control over every single piece of data, right? They're really just saying that for the data that we determine as particularly relevant to identify individuals, PII, or PCI in the case of PCI, it's like credit card numbers. There's a very small set of the broader data set that you need to control, but those pieces of data you definitely need to have control. So maybe the solution or the way to look at a solution to compliance with GenAI really is about shifting the mindset from controlling the system at a very coarse structure level to focus on the data-centric level controls.
So Minhank, kind of the key term seems to be data-centric control. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by data-centric?
Yes. So as I was kind of hinting at, or already mentioned earlier, right? Data-centric control is really the crux of being able to create or begin the journey to compliance for GenAI application. This would mean typically you want to have some way of actually limiting access to data. And right now, one of the best ways to do that is actually encryption or some form of tokenization, such that even as it's moving through the pipeline, there's no way for anyone to access it. But then on top of that, in addition to just preventing inadvertent access or somewhat intercepting access, like some of the breaches that Sushant already mentioned earlier in the headlines, control is also about actually being able to let the right people see it, right? And in our current IT systems, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with RBAC, and that is a great way to actually be able to enforce least privilege. And there's no reason not to be able to not to do that for your GenAI applications as well. And for those of you who are not familiar with RBAC, it really is just saying that we need to have an easy system to give a person or a set of people the right to access a subset or a set or subset of the information on a need-to-know basis. And lastly, one of the things that you really need to think about as far as compliance is concerned for generative AI and control, and it's one that perhaps is easy to overlook because it's almost self-evident, is that you kind of need to be able to prove it, right? Even if you went to all this effort to introduce the necessary data-centric level controls, that is to encrypt the individual data value, define policies that only decrypt it and make it de-identify for the right people, if you actually can't show the auditor or if you can't actually prove that it is working correctly, then you're kind of back to square one, right? I mean, without being too cynical, a lot of this exercise is to actually prove that you're in compliance. So what exactly do we need to do, or what can be done to implement these controls? Well, here at Baffle, we believe that we actually do have a very comprehensive solution for being able to implement access control for generative AI. And we're able to do it for all the use cases. Based on our sort of discussions with customers and based on our research of the most popular ways of using generative AI, we roughly broke it down into 3 general categories of how you might interact or use GenAI services. The first one, and perhaps one that many of you are already familiar with, is just going out and using a public chat or public Q&A service. Typically, the data in these services are not private, so you're not really worried about information or seeing sensitive information that's coming back to you. It really is more about catching the inadvertent or the errant internal employee that might send private data out. So here we have a solution that actually attempts to identify PI that's going out to these public services and actually intercepting it and de-identify it before it goes out. So pretty basic and straightforward understanding that, and I'll go over detail. The other 2 use cases are perhaps more in line with some of the ones that Sushant talked about earlier. So retrieval augmented generation, some of you might be considering doing. It's a sort of the system that you might use to build up a internal chatbot with your private data. And I'll discuss what we can do in terms of securing that in a little bit. And lastly, for the most ambitious amongst our customer and probably amongst you as well, they're actually looking into sort of customizing an LLM for their own individual needs. And by custom, it doesn't always mean that you're going from the ground up and trying to train a brand new LLM. You might actually choose to take an existing foundation LLM and just fine tune it for your specific purposes to get better results there. As alluded to earlier, what we can do as far as being able to use public GenAI services, we have a Baffle data protection for AI proxy that you can actually use as sort of a security gateway in front of access to GenAI services. So what's cool about this proxy is that, for example, in this picture, we can understand the OpenAI APIs and proxy for that, such that if you're if you're going through a web browser, which will be essentially going to ChatGPT, we can actually intercept the PII that's going through there, de-identify it, and make sure that at least the third party won't necessarily see that PII. If you're using retrieval augmented generation to, say, search through your customer support database to help customers get answers quickly, right, or to basically search through a large set of private data set to find insights or to summarize, what we actually can do is the same proxies can actually de-identify the data as you're aggregating them into some central location. So, in the case of Microsoft, they toss in GitHub. In this case, we expect most users to drop in a bucket or some sort of object store. So imagine all the social security numbers, all the emails, all the names get de-identified from the context in their context document before they land, and that's actually what eventually gets used by the retriever and vector database to actually serve up the responses. And likewise, we'll have a symmetrical corresponding proxy on the read side, such that the access control can be enforced when you're trying to actually access that data. So kind of imagine this as bookends, right? On the one end, when data comes in, the sensitive data is de-identified so that after this point, no data will ever be exposed unless there's some policy that allows access to it. And of course, when you actually need to access it, that's when it goes back and checks against your configured policy to make sure that whoever it is that needs to see it truly can see it or is allowed to see it. And of course, because all of this is configured through a central management console, that's where you can actually provide the reporting to prove to your auditors that, in fact, yes, this is how we're enforcing our access control policies for our GenAI application. Likewise, for the training case, it's actually pretty similar. The key difference for those of you who are already familiar with GenAI, various GenAI use cases, is that whereas for RAG, you're using your private data for the purpose of context. These are just documents that you will feed in to provide context to a particular prompt. With training, you're essentially trying to take your private data and convert it into training data that will eventually be used to either build up a new LLM or fine-tune an existing LLM. And there, again, the goal here is still about de-identification of the sensitive data values, right? We're still applying data-centric controls on individual pieces of data and a very small subset of that. So all of that gets de-identified before you land in some sort of training sort of ground for all the data, and then that'll pass through. And of course, in the case where your GenAI application might actually pull that data out of the model for whatever purpose, again, that proxy, that Baffle's GenAI proxy will be able to help intercept that and actually only re-identify the data if the policy allows it. So I talked a lot about what we can do at a high level, and I'm one for believing in sort of show rather than tell. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just go into a quick demo that demonstrates at least a couple of use cases that I described earlier. And to just kind of set things up, I'm going to show you a picture of what the key components are. Right here, if you have thought about GenAI, I'm sure many of you have thought about use cases where you might want to search through your customer support database. For a lot of our customers, that's actually one of the common themes and low-hanging fruit as far as being able to use this. So what we're going to have is a bunch of made-up customer support tickets. These will be in just text documents, completely unstructured. We're going to feed it through our GenAI proxy, and it will essentially be, it will land in some common repository where then the RAG system will pick it up. Now, what you're going to see here is we're actually going to have the RAG system go against OpenAI directly. So OpenAI is a third party. We don't want to send any sensitive data there. So what I've asked our engineers to do is just create a little window into the traffic between our RAG system and the OpenAI service, so you can actually see what sort of information we're sending. And the other aspect of the demo that you're going to see is that we're going to actually make sure the access to the sensitive data values, in this case will be primarily focused on email, will be controlled by the proxy, where one user who has the privilege will be able to see the actual email address, whereas another user who actually is not allowed. So imagine it's just some sort of general guest or public user you may want to help search a knowledge base or solutions. That person should never see any email addresses or PII. So yeah, and just kind of quickly describe what you'll see today. We'll do the upload. If you're familiar with RAG, you'll know that you need to actually index and generate embeddings out of the context documents for the search later. Do the low privilege search, do the high privilege search, and that'll be the gist of it. Oh, by the way, along the way, I'm going to ask for some help from the audience. So if you happen to feel like participating a little bit, I'll ask for some additional information there. Let me see if I can switch and share screen. So give me 1 second, share screen, and I'll double check here. All right, can everybody see a screen that says Baffle Data Protection for AI? I guess.
Yes, Hank, it's we can see it.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So basically, as I was mentioning earlier, I've got a bunch of text tickets, and right now I've got 8 of them. I actually have 10 that I can upload. And they more or less look like this, right? They're you can imagine these as email support tickets that people might have filed. And we can certainly pick I don't know if anybody wants to pick a number between 1 and 10. That'll be the one we'll take a closer look at and inquire about. All right, I don't see anybody who wants to pick a number, so we can do number 5 maybe. And then actually, just to make sure that we're all alive, we can actually upload the rest of the 2. So I've got 8 here. I'm going to upload another 2 more. Sorry, where is it? All right, let's upload ticket number 9. This one's going to be about software compatibility. And for this last one, this is where I'm going to ask, hopefully someone from the audience wants to participate a little bit. So I'm going to delete the body of this and ask for some suggestions as to a common support issue that you might have. And also I'll ask for a generic email address. I want to replace this entire ticket with whatever it is that the audience wants to put on the chat. Anyone? Oh, Sushan's going to be on. Okay, how about this? I got one. So I noticed earlier that a lot of people were having issues with the background noise. So let's go ahead and say the webinar has a noisy background. Okay, dear support team, webinar has, I don't want to spend all this time typing now out, I'll just do a little bit, has distracting background noises. Can the moderator please look into it? Okay. As communication, sure, I'll leave this last one. Any email addresses that people feel like they want to add to the associate with this one? Oh, okay. So Sushan is suggesting we do zuck@meta.org. I guess it's because he just recently testified in Congress. Yeah, I just dated this. Yes, I just dated this webinar, so hopefully it'll hold up over time. But anyway, a little tongue-in-cheek here. We're gonna go ahead and upload that. We're gonna make sure that all 10 tickets are there now. Okay. By the way, this is not part of our product. I asked our engineering team to create this portion of it just to make it easier. In real life, all this text would be part of your data set already from your data sources, and you would ingest into database through our proxy. So go ahead and generate that index. Okay, so let us bring our chatbot over here. All right, I'm going to jump straight into the fun stuff here. Well, let's see. Did we say we're going to look at ticket number 5, the printer's responding? So is there someone who filed a ticket regarding their printer not responding? This is just a sanity check. Okay. What? Oh, by the way, I forgot to highlight the fact we're currently logged in as guest. So this is the low privilege user, as you can imagine. What is the email address for the ticket about printer not responding? Let's go think about it. Okay, so this was one of the things I was trying to highlight earlier, right? The access control. And what you see right here is that even though I can get the system to find the relevant information, and I can even try to get it to retrieve it, the proxy has applied the access control at this point in time to ensure that the email, which I've identified as a PII that I want to control, is restricted based on my policy. And even if I were to look at the network communication, which is essentially what this is, if you look at this, you might actually know why it has all this text. If you're familiar with retrieval augmented generation, what it does is it grabs the entire corpus of contextual information, finds the most relevant one, and sends it to the LLM to search through to find the information. But what's interesting about this is you'll notice that all the email addresses, that were in those documents or context documents have already been encrypted and de-identified. So imagine if you've already defined a policy for controlling all your PIIs that's in your context documents, right? Those values will be in such a form that they will never leak and you'll never run afoul of compliance requirements. So even if you send it to OpenAI, you send it to GCP Vertex, you name it, you'll never actually have any issues there. Now, I promise that you'll be able to actually see the, well, actually, before I switch roles, I want to go back and talk about, do a search for our newly inserted ticket about background noise. So did anyone have issues with background noise in the webinar? This is just a sanity check here. Okay, and what is the email for the ticket with background noise issues? Again, you see that it's mass. We literally just put that in there. This highlights a couple. This highlights a couple of cool things. And one, of course, is why GenAI is compelling. You could literally have search through real unstructured information very quickly, and literally we just re-indexed that and looked it up right away. But it also highlights the power of Baffle solution. We can de-identify this quickly on the fly and ensure that you stay in compliance no matter how the data gets in. We literally just put that in a moment ago. And I'll show you what happens if we switch to the admin user with the proper privileges. Okay, let's switch to the chat binders. By the way, you'll see that the same documents are still loaded. So let's go back to what is the email address for the ticket about background noise. And let's see if Zuck shows up. Hey, there you go. Look, Zuck is there. But the other thing I do want to call out again is notice that even though I've applied access control to this part, right, and that's enforcing a policy on what the end user can see, I still have the policy enforced about what I'm sending to, the third party, in this case, OpenAI. So OpenAI is still seeing all of this, but we are actually decrypting it just for the end user because we're allowing it. So I know that was a lot to take in, but hopefully that kind of demonstrates the power of what we can do with Baffle's data protection for generative AI solution. And hopefully I'm back to the slides.
You are.
All right. So with that, I'll turn it back over to, oh, sorry, actually I do have a poll I forgot to ask. So as you saw earlier, we have this very straightforward, easy way of taking a look at our solution. I'm just curious if anybody out there would like to give this a try for themselves. So you'll see on the poll there. Not surprisingly, we have a good number of folks who want to give it a shot. So, Sushant, I think we should consider making this available.
That's a good idea. So let's summarize and then talk about next steps and how people can actually access this. So keep in mind that as with other data-intensive applications, PI and other regulated data cannot be used in GenAI systems without protecting it, right? The trend is moving toward what makes your company unique is your data. So the applications and the knowledge that your data provides to you, your customers, is really dependent on using that private data, but you need to protect it, right? There is pretty much everyone agrees that the existing regulations should be able to, should apply to GenAI. So thinking of GenAI as, oh, it's a new application, we can use PII data, right? The regulations don't apply, isn't necessarily true, right? You need to make sure that you have the protection in place. And as Minhink has showed, if you don't put in the protection going in, there's a very good chance with adversarial prompting and other things that PI data could be leaked. So the first thing we recommend is protect your data in applications and analytic data stores. That's the source of the data. Make sure it's protected in what Minhink has talked about as data-centric protection. So when that data flows from your applications and analytic data stores into other projects, including GenAI, your data remains secure, right, through the rest of your RAG pipeline. So Baffle Data Protection provides an easy way for you to implement data-centric protection to enable your GenAI and other data projects. So let's talk about next steps and then Q&A. So we asked the question, we showed you the demo of the sandbox. Our recommendation is try it for yourself. So you can see that QR code. There's also, you can see the actual URL. So if you have a mobile phone, pull up that QR code. If you're on a web browser, you can just type in info.baffle.io/demo/GenAI. And then Hormaz has actually pushed out a little note. If you click that box to request sandbox, it'll take you to the page. And what you basically do is you'll meet with a Baffle security expert. And there's kind of three things, right? One is discuss your data security concerns with GenAI, what kind of data you have, what do you want to protect? Then verify the capabilities of the GenAI sandbox, right? Meets your needs, right? You obviously don't want to do it if it's not going to meet your needs. And then lastly, you'll get access to the sandbox. It is a controlled setting, meaning that it's not infinitely scalable, so we have to do regulate access to it and for how long. But this is just to make sure that everyone can load their documents, that no one else can see anyone else's documents and things like that. So pull up that QR code, either type it in or click that box and then in that message, and it'll take you it. Go ahead and book the meeting. You'll talk to our security colleagues and just make sure that this is going to be something that works for you, and then you'll have access. You can try it for yourself and see if this actually can do what you need it to do. So with that, let me have Hormaz come back on, and let's see if we have any questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Minhink and Sushant. Yeah, and yes, we have some great questions coming in from the audience. So first question, I think it's a big one, but how does the proxy de-identify the sensitive data?
Yeah, good question. So it was kind of hard to see in the log, but what it's actually doing is it's using AES encryption, and we obviously encoded in base 64 because most of the GenAI systems deal in text. You'll notice that we also have some metadata in the front. So in the front, we always have a prefix that ensures that we can always identify the encrypted values and separate it from what would be the text values. So the gist of it is when the data comes in, as I was describing in the architecture, it gets encrypted and it gets transformed into an encrypted form with that prefix that helps identify that it's encrypted and it's Baffle encrypted. That metadata is actually also the same basis for how we can enforce the access control downstream, right? So going back to this idea that you want to have a subject permission object, right? We've identified the object and we sort of slapped a way of actually tracking a form MACL on it. And hopefully that kind of answers a question that I also see a little earlier about how do we de-identify the data from GenAI. So, I assume you're talking about the case where it's the RAG or LOM and not the public. Because the public case, their data is already scraped from the internet. So arguably, it essentially is, or it already is non-sensitive. That said, anything that's inside, that you might send to it, we actually use a mix of AI technology as well as regex technology that helps identify the PIIs and de-identify it in the form of either encrypting or masking before sending it out.
Great, excellent. Yep, thank you. All right, our next question, is the Baffle proxy cloud-based proxy or an on-prem virtual or a physical appliance?
I can take that, or if you want to take that, Sushant, either way.
I mean, basically, the answer is it's software. So the advantage of software is you have full control over where you want to put it. Do you want to put it in the cloud, in a virtual machine? Do you want to put it on-prem? Do you want to deploy it on a box? Do you want to deploy it in a virtual machine or in Kubernetes clusters? You have all those options available to you. I know a lot of folks are moving toward cloud services, but we find that software gives the flexibility to ensure that you have the full control. And we as a company never touch your data, right? So your data never is seen by anyone at Baffle because it's software. You have full control over your data as well as how you deploy the software. I mean, Hank, anything to add for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not SaaS. I think that's for some people might expect it to be a managed service. And the whole point about ensuring control is that you don't need another party for which you need to have some agreement with to demonstrate improved control, right? So you deploy in your own system and it is yours.
I see, Elizabeth,
Okay.
you got another question. I would suggest set up a meeting and then we can go through, I guess, in detail the questions you have, because I think having some additional slides to walk you through what's actually happening may be helpful. So again, right, in addition to that same meeting link that you say, if you have questions about what it is and specifically how we do it, we're happy to go into more detail in that one.
All right. One other question is, my company uses data loss prevention. Why can't I use that with GenAI?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question as well. I mean, DLP generally, so for those of you who are not familiar with DLP technology, right, it's been around for a while. Its job is very similar to kind of the first use case I described, which is it's trying to filter or sort of prevent exfiltration of sensitive information, typically on the way out of your internet. And for those of you who actually are familiar with it, you also know that it's hardly perfect, and it was also designed for an era where it's not proxying for a GenAI or OpenAI and other GenAI services. So the thing is that in this context, it's kind of to demonstrate the control for compliance, you kind of need to have an all or nothing as far as access control is concerned. Right? That's what we were describing earlier about the whole subject object and permission, and be able to show that policy. And with DLP, it's one of those cases where it's going to make a best effort and actually does a pretty good job most of the time, but it really isn't going to meet that threshold where you can actually truly demonstrate that you have full control over the sensitive data values.
Okay, wonderful. One more question. How soon will regulations come on GenAI?
That's a good question. So let me take a first step and let's see if Minhank has anything to add. Our essential position on this is the current regulations apply to GenAI, right? So if you look at the regulations for PCI DSS, if you look at it for HIPAA, GDPR, there's California Consumer Protection Act, there's a whole number of regulations. They talk about applications of and usage of data, not necessarily a specific application. So our belief is that those regulations will apply to GenAI, right? So if you're building out GenAI applications, you're using any kind of regulated data, you need to be in compliance with the relevant data, whether it's credit card information, European citizen data, you need to be in compliance with that. That said, regulators, government agencies have realized that there's kind of a little bit of a Wild West going on. And so they may provide additional guidance, or they may provide additional things specifically for GenAI. But hopefully that is going to be well thought out and ensure that there's privacy without necessarily getting in the way of innovation. But I would argue that if you look at the regulations, they cover GenAI now. Minhank, anything to add?
I mean, just a little bit. You hit the nail on the head as far as the regulations are concerned. But maybe for those who are looking for a little bit more resource, not surprisingly, National Institute of Standards Technology, or NIST, has published a few things recently around looking at the threat vectors and the risk around generative AI. So that might be worth looking for. Just do an online search or ask ChatGPT. And you'll be able to find information to that extent. It will speak to a lot of the same things that we speak about here, right? Perhaps it was so fast, you may not have caught it. A lot of risk comes from the fact that you're moving a lot of data into one place, and you have the opportunity to access that through some form of adversarial prompting or unexpected behavior. There's also other risks that they identify. Well, that's not purely technical, but it's a good point of reference if you're really concerned about the direction of various regulations and compliance.
Very good. Okay, well, I think with that was all the questions we had coming in, and I don't see any more questions popping up. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us and for making this interactive and participating in the polls and the questions. And thank you to Minheng and Sushant for being our speakers today. Hope everybody has a good day, and we'll hope to chat with you soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah.